If you grew up in the 1980s, you experienced the last decade of Cold War tension mixed with unprecedented optimism, the birth of consumer culture as we know it, and the transition from scarcity to abundance. And psychologists are discovering that this unique combination created a generation with remarkable resilience, technological adaptability, and what researchers call optimistic pragmatism that no other generation possesses. Let's talk about something that gets dismissed as pure nostalgia, but is actually deep psychology. If you grew up in the 1980s, roughly born between 1975 and 1985, you experienced a cultural moment that was simultaneously the end of one era and the explosive beginning of another. You're old enough to remember life before the internet, but young enough to have grown up with personal computers, video games, and MTV. You experienced the last years of the Cold War's existential dread while also living through Reagan-era optimism and economic boom. And research from developmental psychology reveals that this contradiction, threat and optimism existing simultaneously, created a unique psychological profile. You're resilient because you grew up with underlying anxiety, but optimistic because you also experienced genuine hope and possibility. Research on formative experiences shows that the cultural atmosphere during your childhood and adolescence shapes your baseline expectations about the world. If you grew up in the 1980s, your formative years happened during a fascinating paradox. On one hand, you had nuclear war drills, the day after traumatizing an entire generation, HIV/AIDS crisis emerging, war on drugs propaganda. You grew up with background existential dread. But simultaneously, you had blockbuster movies, booming economy, technological revolution, rise of personal computing, birth of MTV and music video culture, explosion of consumer choice. You learned that the world is dangerous and full of possibility at the same time. This created what psychologists call realistic optimism. You believe good things can happen, but you're not naive about potential dangers. Here's what separates 80s kids from other generations. You're the bridge between scarcity and abundance. Your early childhood might have had 3 TV channels, limited toy options, 1 phone line for the whole family. But by your teenage years, you had cable TV with dozens of channels, Walkmans for personal music, video rental stores with hundreds of choices, early video game systems, personal computers entering homes. You experienced the transition from limited options to overwhelming choice during your most formative years. Studies show this creates psychological flexibility. You can function in both constrained and abundant environments because you've experienced both. Let's talk about the specific technological revolution you witnessed. You're the first generation to grow up with home computers and video games as normal household items. Research shows that early exposure to computer interfaces during childhood creates different neural pathways than learning them as adults. You didn't just adapt to technology, you helped shape how it evolved. You learned to program in BASIC, played Oregon Trail in school, figured out DOS commands, mastered early video game logic. Neuroscientists studying generational brain differences find that 80s kids have unique cognitive patterns from growing up during the personal computer revolution. You think in terms of systems, interfaces, and user experience in ways that pre-computer generations don't. Here's the MTV generation effect that shaped your psychology. You're the first generation raised on music videos, where music wasn't just audio, it was visual narrative. Research on media influence shows that MTV fundamentally changed how your generation processes information. You expect multimedia, you think in terms of visual storytelling, you have shorter attention spans for pure audio or pure text, but longer attention spans for integrated audio-visual content. Critics call this MTV attention deficit, but researchers note it's actually adaptation to richer information environments. You're not damaged by MTV. You're trained for the multimedia internet age that came later. Research on economic psychology reveals something crucial about 80s kids. You grew up during economic boom times, the Reagan economy, rising stock market, growing middle class, consumer culture exploding. Your parents probably did better economically than their parents. You internalized the message that economic growth is normal, that upward mobility is possible, that hard work leads to success. But then you entered adulthood during recessions, dot-com crash, 2008 financial crisis, economic instability. Studies show this creates what economists call cautious optimism. You believe success is possible, unlike cynical Gen X, but you're not entitled about it, unlike some boomers. You hustle because you've seen both boom and bust. Let's address the latchkey kid experience that defined many 80s childhoods. Like 70s kids, you often came home to empty houses, but by the 80s this had become so normalized it had a name. Research shows latchkey kids developed strong independence, self-reliance, and resourcefulness. But 80s latchkey kids had something earlier generations didn't: early technology. You had cable TV, video games, computers to keep you company. Studies note this created a unique relationship with technology. You learned early that technology could be companion, not just tool. This predicted your comfort with social media, online communities, and digital relationships that older generations struggle with. Here's the Cold War psychology component. You grew up under nuclear threat. You saw The Day After. You had duck-and-cover drills. You knew what the sirens meant. Psychological research on children who grew up during the Cold War shows persistent low-level anxiety, but also remarkable resilience. You learned that existential threats can exist without materializing. You learned to function normally while carrying background dread. When you witnessed the Berlin Wall fall and Cold War end during your adolescence, it was psychologically profound. The existential threat you'd lived under your whole childhood suddenly ended. Research shows this created generational relief and optimism that shaped your worldview. Seemingly permanent problems can actually be solved. Studies on consumer culture reveal that 80s kids experienced its birth. Shopping malls became the social center of teenage life. Brand names exploded in importance. MTV brought advertising directly into music. You're the first generation where consumption became identity. Critics say this made you materialistic, but research shows something more nuanced. You understand that consumption is performance, that brands communicate social messages, that shopping is both economics and psychology. You're not naive consumers. You're media literate about consumption in ways that enable you to navigate modern consumer culture critically. Let's talk about the diversity of 80s media that shaped you. You had arcade culture, Saturday morning cartoons, after-school specials, primetime TV, blockbuster movies, music videos, early video games, books, magazines. Each medium offered different forms of storytelling and engagement. Research shows that multimedia exposure during childhood builds cognitive flexibility. You can process information through multiple channels because you practiced with all of them. Younger generations who grew up with primarily screens and older generations who grew up with primarily books, radio don't have this same multimedia fluency. Here's the educational psychology piece. You went to school during a transitional period. Traditional education was still dominant, but computers were entering classrooms. You learned to type on actual typewriters and on computers. You did research in libraries and on early internet. You wrote by hand and on word processors. Studies show this created useful dual capability. You can function in both analog and digital educational professional environments. You're not confused by new technology like older workers, but you also have foundational skills, handwriting, research in books, working without constant connectivity, that younger generations lack. Research on friendship formation reveals that 80s kids developed social skills in a unique environment. You made friends through unstructured outdoor play, organized activities, and through early digital means, early gaming communities, bulletin board systems, eventually early internet chat. You experienced both analog and digital friendship formation, which studies show creates broader social adaptability. You can make friends in person and online, through activities and through digital communities, because you practiced both during formative years. Let's address the stranger danger generation label. 80s kids experienced the explosion of missing children awareness. Milk cartons, Amber Alert origins, heightened parental fear. But you also still played outside unsupervised more than current generations. Research shows this created informed caution without paralyzing fear. You learned to be aware of danger while still taking reasonable risks. This is healthier than either oblivious freedom or fearful restriction. Here's the music identity component. 80s music wasn't just entertainment, it was tribal. You were pop, rock, metal, hip-hop, punk, new wave, or country. Your musical choice communicated your identity. Research shows that musical preferences formed during adolescence remain most emotionally powerful throughout life. For 80s kids, music was both personal soundtrack and social identifier. The intensity of 80s musical nostalgia isn't just missing songs, it's missing when music was central to identity formation. Studies on resilience and adaptability show that 80s kids score high on both. Why? You experienced significant change during formative years: technological revolution, end of Cold War, economic shifts, cultural transitions. Your baseline includes change and adaptation. Research shows that people who learn flexibility young maintain it throughout life. You're comfortable with change because it's what you know. Let's talk about the blockbuster culture that shaped your expectations. 80s movies were events: E.T., Star Wars sequels, Indiana Jones, Back to the Future,